In October, the government announced its long-awaited net zero strategy, a complex and wide-ranging pathway to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. But is there enough investment available to realise the government's plans to fight back against the climate crisis? It's hard to put a solid number on the true cost of net zero. The Climate Change Committee estimate around £50 billion might be needed each year from 2030 onwards. The National Grid project a total of £3 trillion could be required. Rightly or wrongly, the government's plan for net zero requires the private sector to play a key part in achieving their goals.
This strategy will harness the power of the private sector, giving businesses and industry the certainty they need to invest and grow in the UK to make the UK home to new ambitious projects. The policies and spending brought forward in the strategy, along with regulations, will leverage up to £90 billion of private investment by 2030, levelling up our former industrial heartlands.
We very much don't think that the journey to net zero is one that should be or can be entirely funded through the public purse. And this is really all about leveraging private investment. And that means a lot of work for government, by the way, because you have to create the conditions for private investment, be that in wind, nuclear, new buildings, and that's a whole combination of regulatory levers, spend levers, specific deals, and so on. But I think it's just really important to emphasise at the very beginning that when you see estimates of the amount of investment needed to fuel the transition to net zero, we would only expect a small portion of that to come from the public sector.
Critics of the government's approach say the level of investment proposed doesn't match the net zero rhetoric.
And while there is modest short-term investment, there is nothing like the commitment we believe is required. Germany is offering €9 billion for a new hydrogen strategy. The UK, 240 million, and we're putting off decisions till later in the decade. And Mr. Speaker, we see the same pattern across the board, including on land use, industry and transport. And because of this failure to invest, there remains this chasm between promises and delivery.
I think it's important to say right up front in this hearing that we believe that this strategy represents a credible plan to reach net zero. Do we believe there is enough money? We will undoubtedly come back to that question down the path, but for now, yes, we think the funding commitments made here represent, for the next few years, the right first step on a credible path to deliver.
The problem for the government is that the immediacy of the climate emergency necessitates changes that our economy isn't built to cope with. There is, in a sense, a disconnect between the move towards a green economy and the required actions needed to get there.
What we see very clearly is that there's a battle at work here between the business department and possibly number 10 and the Treasury. And the Treasury just hasn't got the memo about us being in a climate emergency, and the Chancellor is still seeing net zero as a threat and a risk and a cost rather than an economic opportunity. And that's really, really troubling, because we need to see these big investments. We need to see Treasury signed up to the changes we need to make. So in the budget, we saw air passenger duty for domestic flights cut, encouraging people to fly more when obviously they should be taking the train. We still have a £27 billion road building programme. All of that money should be put into public transport. We need Treasury to get involved to make sure that the cheapest and easiest thing to do is also the greenest thing to do. And usually at the moment, we've got the reverse of that.
That is a little bit problematic, that paradigm, when it comes to meeting our carbon targets, because essentially what we try and do is we put growth first as the target and then say, well, given that we want growth, let's try and meet that target. But there's another way round of doing that, which is to say, what we need to do is meet our carbon target. That's a non-negotiable. And therefore, we should figure out what the economy looks like underneath that. If it's got some growth in it, great. If it hasn't got growth in it because we can't afford that growth, because we can't meet our carbon target, if we keep pushing these growth-based sectors, then we should learn to do without it, and we should figure out what the economy looks like without it. So the paradigm shift, in a way, is going from a position which says growth first and then see if we can meet the targets first, see what the economy looks like underneath that. And that in its essence, I think, is the approach that we need when we understand how quickly we've got to meet these carbon targets.
Whether it's lighting our streets, getting from A to B, or simply powering our homes, decarbonising the economy and ending our business as usual approach will require sourcing funds from as many different avenues as possible.
A carbon tax would put the right incentive into the market, so everything that used fossil fuels and produced carbon dioxide would become more expensive, and that would be like a huge lever we could put on the whole economy, forcing it towards a net zero future and a low carbon future. So companies that had already invested in tech that allowed them to produce less CO2, they would benefit, and other companies would be forced to move in that direction.
The true cost of net zero will become clearer in the coming years as industry, technology and the wider economy adapts to its new economic brief. But the cost of not hitting net zero will be stark for our environment and our economy. Can we afford to hit net zero? The fact is, we can't afford not to.
No, we can't. We can't afford to not hit net zero. That's absolutely clear. And we can't really afford to not hit net zero in the next decade or so. That's the implication, in a sense, of that Office of Budget Responsibility report that I was talking about. That's a massive uptick in our, probably unsustainable uptick in our public debt associated with meeting the costs of a 2, 2.5, 2.7 or 3 degree world. And getting below 2 degrees is absolutely essential. We know that. And getting below 2 degrees, ideally to 1.5 degrees, really means hitting net zero by the middle of the 2030s, not even by 2050. 2050 is too late already. So we've got to make most of the progress towards that net zero target within the next decade and a half at the very most. And that means very early action. It will incur some costs, but the costs of not doing it are inconceivable. We can't afford the costs of not doing it.